Well, hello there again. Right, I'm going to show you some different pencil techniques now, looking at this magnolia flower. Now I'm using all of the methods for translating this image onto another piece of A4 that we've discussed earlier. If you need a reminder of those, then go to the tutorial about how to prepare your drawing. As you can see, I've used the standard grid, the 5 cm grid on my A4 photograph. And I've translated the image onto here. You can see I've left a little bit of the grid there, and that just helps to show how what methods I've used to get the drawing. The line drawing, which is of course the edges of the light and shade in this whole picture. Now, I'd want to just show you a few pencil techniques because there's quite a lot of complexity within here. And of course, you can get this photograph from me from the website or email to ask for it. And looking at very fine areas like this, where you've got a really thin edge of light, and how would you approach something like that, or some of these shapes here? So we're going to have a little look at that, and I'm just going to show both of the pages at the same time so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, and we're going to start by looking at this top edge up here. Now you can see that there's a very fine area of light, and what I've done in my drawing, of course, is to separate out the little area of light as I've been putting it down on the page. But here I've just drawn one line. Now what I'm going to find is that when I start to draw this and shade in properly to get the balance of light and shade, I'm actually going to run out of room there. Because as you can see, the pencil thickness, if I was to actually draw that line, I'd be making it dark, wouldn't I? The dark of the graphite will be completely covering up that light. So what I want to do instead is to think a little bit ahead and to actually draw on either side of that light space. So I'm creating a little bit of a road, and it's going to look a lot thicker there, but what I can do is I can gradually make that smaller. So if I start by just enhancing the line on both sides, so I'm looking at the shaded spaces on either side of that very fine light edge of petal. And just remember, every line you draw is the division between light and shade, isn't it? It's the edge of light, it's where the light's changing. So I'm just enhancing that, and I'm melting the line into the shaded area. Remember, a line needs to blend into the shadow. When you create a dark line, it's the edge of a shadow. It's not an outline. So what I do on the same side here, which is this area here, the line I've drawn is the darker area of flower, which we see creating the silhouette of the light line of petal. So here I'm just going to again create a nice clean crisp edge and blend into the larger dark space of the flower. And that is how to create a very fine white line. Of course, now if I just shade over that, of course you can use a rubber, just use a normal eraser. You can rub directly into a drawing if you make a mistake. And of course, because I'm using a big clunky rubber there, it's made a large light area, which I then need to again hone and just get the delicacy of the fine white line, fine white space back. But it's always that conversation between light and dark, and thinking every time to yourself, what can I see? And remember that when you're drawing something, you're seeing the edges of light and shade. You're seeing a difference there between the light and the shade, and that's why you know that there is a shape there. So here I am filling in this darker section there, and I've left the very fine edge. Now, one thing you can do with these pencils is just to make sure that even when you've got a fine line, even when you're just using one pencil, create a crisp edge. Remember when we did the pencil tutorial and I was talking about the texture that's created at the edges of the light and the shade? So if I make sure that the edges of this light space are very crisp and clear, you see how that suddenly pops out? There's this amazing bright, clean white line which just emerges off the page, just like that. Okay, so let's have a look at another little area which might create some intrigue. So up here, so just a little bit higher up in my drawing, because there's quite a variety of lights and darks in there. Now, what I want to think of every time I'm doing a drawing, I've got three main, just count them, 1, 2, 3, three main areas of light and shade to think about. So you have your lightest, you have your darkest, and you have everything in between. Okay, now the lightest areas on a white piece of paper are obviously represented by the paper, because you can't get any lighter than the white paper, can you? So you want to look at your image and work out where are the lightest areas. Come on, picture. Where are the lightest areas in the whole image which you want to leave as white paper? So obviously here, the very, very bright light edges around the sides of the petals, especially here, lovely crisp edges. The more light paper you can leave, the more light and the more contrast between the bright and the dark aspects of the picture, the more three-dimensional it's going to look. So I want to make sure I'm leaving some lovely bits of white paper along here, and then I've got the darkest areas. So I start looking for the darkest shadows and shapes within the whole image, and of course everything else is in between. Now, it's a little bit of a joke between me and my students about the bit everything in between, because of course there's an absolute myriad of different tones you can get. But if you think from a simplicity point of view, that your lightest, your darkest, and everything in between, your lightest is already dealt with on the paper, so you're only thinking about your darkest shapes and all of the in-between shadows, and that just makes it feel so much easier, doesn't it? Now I'm going to look at this space here, and I'm going to deal with that in the same way that I dealt with this light line. I'm going to create a crisp edge just along here, crisp edge which defines the petal, and blend that edge into the shadow. And I'm going to meet it here. There's another crisp, clean edge. Now, creating a crisp edge might feel like you're doing an outline, but it's never an outline. It's the edge of light and shade. And by creating that crisp line, I blend that into the shadow. You take that line and you blend it into the darkest space. So here, the edge of this petal, you can see that the line there, the petal here is slightly lighter and the petal there is slightly darker. So the line that I'm drawing here becomes that dark shape of shadow. Don't worry if it feels like that's a complicated concept. The more that you do, even if you don't use those terms and words in your mind as you're drawing, the more that you do, you'll just start to implicitly understand about the light and the shade and why you're seeing these lines and what happens to them. Okay, so I'm trying to establish some of these dark spaces, because that's going to help me work out then all my tones in between. If I can figure out with this 2B pencil, how dark do I want to go? All right, so you see I've created a box around this whole shadow, so I can just freely take my time to fill that in with nice loose marks. Now, as soon as you start creating the shadows, rather than just having a line drawing, you instantly start to notice whether your lines are in the right place and whether you've got these shapes right. Now, I can tell from this that as I've created that shape of shadow, you see how thin this line of light is, and I haven't quite made it thin enough there. So it's much easier to notice when you start filling in your shadows. So I'm just going to make that shadow space a little bit wider. Now here it's a little bit more peaked there, isn't it? And there's a bit of darkish middle toned pink here. Now again, I'm not going to worry too much about the creating contour along these petals because they're quite small shapes. Now this is a good way to look at the line and which way the line goes idea again. So if I look at this photograph, the pink is slightly darker than the green of the leaves behind. So that means that the line I've drawn here needs to become the pink of the petal. So the line blends into your darkest shape. So there we go. We blend the line in like that. And up through here, there's a little bit of variation. See how by just varying the line that I make where the light meets the dark, it creates a different sense of texture. And along here, there's quite a nice crisp line. Now through this section here, see how there's a little bit of variation in the light there. So maybe I'll just draw that shape in first so I know that this is where the shading changes. And I've got my pencil at a nice loose angle. Look how far back I'm holding my pencil. Try not to do too much of this because it creates a very small pivot point for you, and you might find it. Look how my knuckles are clenching that. Look how white they've gone just from gripping it. A bit like you're using a pen to write. But the more you can relax when you're using your pencil, the further back you can hold it. It gives you much more movement to create long lines. So I can use the pencil, because I'm pivoting all the way back here, I can get a much looser line. If I want to, I can create very long shapes, and it gives me so many more options for shading in. And here again, it doesn't really matter if I vary the line. See the consistency of pressure that I'm using? So it's actually creating quite a solid block of shadow there. If I had inconsistent pressure, I'd start to see the lines of the pencil when they meet the end point and come back. So I want to make sure I've got a consistent pressure that's filling in the space so it all looks relatively even. And that's the point where it gets a little bit lighter in here. So I just vary the pressure slightly up through this part. But there isn't a really strong physical line there, is there? So perhaps I just blend that a little bit by doing a middle pressure across that line. And then again on this side. Now remember with the pear, when I was doing the pear, it didn't really matter how I created the shading inside the shadow. As long as you don't have any very strong marks which stand out and distract the eye, you can actually fill in here pretty much loosely, roughly, whatever kind of style just happens to come out the end of your pencil. It doesn't need to look like a photograph. You're doing a drawing, but getting the balance of the light and shade is so important, and the texture, the feeling of the object, and that is created mostly by these edges. You see how even though the pencil marks all the way through this shaded area are very loose and soft, you still feel that the petals themselves have a crispness and a clarity because of the way that I've created these very clean shapes of light. Okay, so that should give you a few additional tips for how to do a slightly more technical drawing. And while you have a go at yours, I'm just going to continue with mine, and I'll meet you later. Hello again. I've actually just done a little bit additional work, just a couple of minutes. And as I was starting to look at some of these layers, I thought it might be quite a good time for us to meet again and just to have a little chat about some of these layers. Now, I do keep saying, look at what's really there. It's something that crops up in so many of my classes and my sessions. I'll say to my students, don't draw what you think is there or paint what you think is there. Do what's really there. But it can take a little bit of time actually working out what it is that you're really seeing, working out what is really there. And occasionally it just helps to sit down and have a little conversation with yourself about some of these areas in the picture, whatever you're doing. If you start finding an area like this being complicated, feeling difficult, like having to work out the light pink and the dark pink and the layering and the shading, because this petal here changes from light pink to dark pink there. So how do you do that bit and that bit? And it can start feeling really complicated. Just each time break it down into little bits. It's one of the reasons why we use the grid. It's one of the reasons why you can cover bits up and just look at a small section and just say to yourself, what am I seeing? Remember that your pencil lines are the edges of light and shade. So each pencil line you draw is the division between two kinds of light. And so you just have to sometimes really look closely. So along here, let's have a look at that little space in my drawing. Along here, I've got this line coming down there. And right, can you see that? I think I need to just move it up a little bit, don't I? Let's just shift this up slightly. There we go. So this space down here, I've drawn a line, and as the light changes direction, my shading from here, that line goes into the darker area of the petal here. But as the line comes in front of this petal, it's darker there. So here, my line becomes that part of the petal. And then it starts to feel, oh my goodness me, what's going on here? It can feel very complicated, but it's not, I promise, if you just slow yourself down. So I'm shading this in, because all of this is darker than that, isn't it? So the line that I've got here, the division between these two petals, that line needs to be part of this pink petal. So I'm going to make all of that a mid-tone, and I can see quite a strong line there in my pencil work, so I just need to blend that. Okay, so you see how the outlined look has suddenly vanished because I've blended that line into the pink. So down here, the edge of this petal, which is my drawn line there, the edge of that petal needs to blend into the dark shape underneath, because the shadow is right down there. See how that dark shape becomes this. Oh, we're getting to a really nice bright edge. That's going to be exciting to do. So my dark shape all the way down there, from that edge it blends down, and you start getting the layering of shadow that is in the photograph. You're replicating exactly what you see in front of you just by saying to yourself, what can I see? Which way does my line go? Because of course your lines are all shadows. And you don't have to worry too much about the way that you're creating the look of texture. Sometimes just little lines, see how these little lines are creating that look of the petal. I'm doing slight curves like that, which all follow round the shape of the petal. But again, my priority is the edges of these petals because I want to make sure that the flower looks crisp and clean and very fine and light. And the way to do that is to make sure that all the edges here have a clarity and a crispness to them. Okay, now, just as we did earlier, the edge of this petal here, incredibly bright and fine and light. So I want to make sure that I'm creating a little bit of a road on my drawing here. I'm going to make a wider light space, much wider than in the photograph, and then I can close it. So first of all, I create the shadow, I blend my line into the darker area, and then I can close that line, make it more narrow. Now remember, I want it to be crisp, so I'm just using the edge of the pencil, pressing a little bit harder, but each time I draw a line, I need to blend it into the shaded area, so you never have a cut out look which is just lines. And so here I can just keep on narrowing that light space. It's just all done with a pencil, with one pencil. Gradually make that light line thinner and thinner. So this time I've narrowed it from the other side, and every time I need to make sure when I've got a line, which way does the shadow go? It blends up here, and you see how that very crisp light edge of petal is now starting to pop out there. Okay, well, I hope that's given you some really good tips with how to translate some very, very fine light edges into a drawing of a botanical nature. And of course, all of these techniques work for absolutely any image. It's always just remembering the light and the dark, where they meet. That explains and describes texture, whether it's a clean cut line or whether it's got a little bit of a fuzzy blur to it. You see, if I do that there, see how instantly we have a crisp line around the outside. And then if I fuzz it down one edge, you see how that suddenly looks like a textured, furry kind of object, as opposed to here. It's all about the clarity of describing where the light meets the dark. Those are the most important parts of any drawing that you do. Doesn't really matter what technique you use through the center areas of shadow while you're learning. It's just remembering those three major areas: lightest, darkest, and everything in between. And you will start to produce some beautiful drawings. Okay, your turn now. Have some fun.